Okay, and welcome to this edition of the Native News Update on this Wednesday, August 31st. I'm your host for today's program, Paul DeMain. Many of the stories right here can also be found at our website at IndianCountryNews.com, and here are some of the news stories from the day from the Associated Press and other Native news sources. Archaeologists working on a historical study at Fort Rosalie, Mississippi, have unearthed human remains. Kathleen Jenkins, superintendent of Natchez National Historic Park, tells the Natchez Democrat that the skeleton is probably from the 19th century. Jenkins says it was found facing east-west with its arms crossed, which also indicates a formal burial. Jenkins says nothing indicates that the remains were of Native American descent. If the remains had been Native Americans, she said legal concerns could have come up since interfering with a Native American burial ground is a federal offense. Adams County Coroner James Lee says a skull was found first and then the remains. He photographed as much as he could of the burial bones and then left them where they laid. The Arizona Department of Transportation has been awarded a $12.4 million grant in federal funds to do a highway-related efforts across the state of Arizona. ADOT says more than $8 million will be directed to 5 improvements and safety projects in tribal communities of the Cocopa in Yuma County, the Kaibab Band of Paiute Indians in Coconino County, the Tohono-O'odham Nation in Pima County, Colorado River Indian Tribes in La Paz County, and the Chimawave Tribe in the Mojave County. The cash will be used to help pay for a new bridge. Some of the cash will also help pay for a new bridge over US 95 in Yuma and pedestrian improvements in downtown Winslow. It's been a quarter of a century since the traditional hunting and fishing rights were restored to members of the Klamath Tribes. Former tribal chair, 77-year-old Chuck Kimball, remembers the fight to reinstate those rights as difficult, an uphill political battle. It was a battle, he says, that left its wounds. The Klamath, Modoc, and Yahuskin were stripped of tribal status in 1954. It took decades to get that status back. Members of the tribes were conducting a 4-day celebration in honor of the 25th anniversary of the August 1986 federal reinstatement of their tribal status. After termination, as much as 70% of the Klamath tribe moved away from the area. Senator Arthur Watkins and Interior Secretary Douglas McKay led termination in the 1950s as part of, according to a federal commission, an effort to integrate Indians into the rest of the population as the best solution to the, quote, Indian problem, unquote. The Klamath tribe was terminated in 1954 under the Klamath Termination Act. Under termination, members of the Klamath, Modoc, and Yahuskin tribes were required to choose between remaining as tribal members or withdrawing and receiving monetary payments of $43,000 each. Of the 2,133 members, 1,600 members withdrew. The Klamath sought to preserve treaty hunting and fishing rights through the courts. The landmark case was Kimball versus Callahan, when the Ninth Circuit Court ruled termination did not specifically void Klamath hunting and fishing rights that had been reserved by their treaties. The remaining members voted to end their trust relationship with the U.S. National Bank of Oregon in 1971, which led to liquidation of the remaining former reservation lands in 1972. Each remaining member then received a payment of $273,000. Edison Chiloquan, however, refused to accept payment and began a vigil that later resulted in congressional legislation that ceded Chiloquan ownership of the land over the Sprague River, which remains titled in his family to this day. After years of political efforts, legislation restoring tribal rights to members of the 3 tribes under the Klamath Tribes was signed in August of 1986. A tribe has dropped its lawsuit against Nebraska about whether the state has authority over doctors hired by the tribe. The Ponca Tribe of Nebraska and a doctor it hired, Rosa Huggett, filed the federal lawsuit in June because the state had refused to recognize Hoggett's credentials. But in a recent filing, an attorney for the tribe and Hoggett said the lawsuit was being dismissed because the state had changed its stance and acknowledged that a tribal clinic in Hoggett fell under federal jurisdiction. Hoggett, who was licensed in Puerto Rico, was hired in July of 2010 after the National Health Care Overall Measure was adopted. She was named director and was the only doctor of the tribe's Fred Leroy Health and Wellness Center in Omaha. The Red Lake Reservation was once a sea of red and white pines, but tribal officials say the federal government mismanaged the forest starting in the early 1900s. The pines were never successfully replanted, and thick stands of less valuable aspen took their place. Now the Red Lake Nation is preparing to reforest 50,000 acres of its land in northwest Minnesota. The Ojibwe Band won a $53 million settlement from the federal government in the year 2001, and Minnesota Public Radio reported that the tribe is using that money to grow its own pine seedlings. More than 250,000 seedlings will be planted next year, starting in the spring. The tribe's goal is to reforest about 1,000 acres annually for the next 50 years. Idaho prison officials say they have leveled a tribal sweat lodge and reconfigured a patch of ground that had served for the religious needs of Native American inmates for more than 25 years at a prison south of Boise. Idaho Department of Corrections spokesman Jeff Ray says the work done last week at the South Idaho Correctional Institution was intended to address both health and security concerns. The prison's Native American inmates are frustrated by the department's actions. However, Ray says officials intend to rebuild the sweat lodge and maintain the parcel for tribal worship. Ray also says the prison intends to carve out some separate space on the grounds for inmates of other earth-based faiths to worship. And that's going to be the latest roundup of news from Indian Country on this edition of the Native News Update. We want to say miigwech for showing up, and you come back again soon.